Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Menachot Daf Yudalid. There's a study guide which will help you with the flow. I'm not going to necessarily share it, but you can use it to help follow the flow of the Gemara. It's a bit of a confusing daf, I will warn you. Okay, we're going to get started back from the Mishna. Shachat shni kvasim le'echol echam menachalot lemachal. So if you slaughter, remember we have these two sheep that need to be slaughtered. The two of them, okay, without both of them, they each go with, the two sheep go with 2 loaves of bread. If you went to the bread bakery, you'll see they're very, very large loaves. Now, the slaughtering of the 2 permits the 2 loaves. If you don't slaughter both of them, you can't have the 2 loaves. Okay, this is what we call it's a matir. Remember, we've talked about this many times. One thing permits something else. So the slaughtering and obviously the, sprinkling the blood, finishing the process of dealing with the 2 sheep, permits the bread to be eaten. So now the question is, usually what is pigul? You have a thought during one of the acts that is a matir. Usually it would be either shlita or zriko, or really could be any of the 4 avodot, even though not all 4 of them are matirs, like the carrying and the accepting the blood as a matir. But in all those 4 avodot, you could have a thought about doing something, right? Like a thought while you're slaughtering that you're going to eat the bread in the wrong time. So here you slaughter both of them. So you did it during the whole matir. Okay, we're going to get into this whole machloket of mifaglim b'chatzi matir, lo mifaglim b'chatzi matir. Our Mishna clearly holds you need to have had the pigul thought in order for it to be pigul during the slaughtering of both of the sheep, because slaughtering one sheep doesn't permit anything. So a pigul thought during one of them wouldn't really do anything. Now Rabbi Meir disagrees with this point, but Rabbi Meir doesn't appear in our Mishnah. So shachat shni kvasim le'echol echam menachalot lemachar. Now, so you had the thought during both of the important events that are the matirs, but your thought was only about eating one of the breads. So how does that affect the other loaf? That's a big question in the Mishnah. Rabbi Yosi says, right, and again the same thing for the 6 loaves of lechem apanim versus the other 6 loaves. Okay, without getting into all those details, Rabbi Yosi said only the bread that you had the pigul thought about, or the set of loaves that your pigul thought was about, but not the other. Okay? The rabbis say, no, one affects the other. Came Rav Huna, and Rav Huna said, oh, you know what? From Rabbi Yosi, what can we learn? That if you have a thought about eating one part of the meat, the calf, the right calf of one of the animal, let's say it's not the shtei alechem korban, it's a regular sacrifice. While you're slaughtering it, you think, I'm going to eat the left calf, or while you're sprinkling the blood, or right while you're doing Kabbalah or holacha, you say, I'm going to eat the right calf in the wrong time, tomorrow, or the day after, depending on what kind of korban. Then, what happens? Only that right calf is a problem. Just like he differentiates between the 2 loaves, also we would differentiate, now it's a big difference here, we're going to have a big discussion about this, and a lot of difficulties, till we ultimately reject this reason, this Rav Huna position. But he says it's the same thing as 2 loaves, okay? Thought about one loaf doesn't affect the other. And then he says it's based on logic and it's based on a pasuk. Okay, that we did in yesterday's daf. Now we're going to start with this Eitivei Rav Nachman le Rav Huna. Rav Nachman brings a difficulty on Rav Huna from this other braita. It says in this braita, Lo olam ein bo karet. Okay, we're going to talk about this word lo olam later. It's a very strong word. There's definitely no karet until ad shifagel b'shtehen b'kazayit. Now what's shtehen? Okay, you have to know some Hebrew grammar. That's feminine. What word is feminine here? What are we talking about? Both of them? Because both the loaves. Okay? Now, he's saying kind of 2 things here. That's what makes it a little bit confusing. You're not going to get karet for, now what's the karet? The karet comes in when you eat, for eating any of the breads, unless the pigul thought was about both of them and a kazayit combined. Okay? It's kind of saying 2 things. It's saying, number 1, sounds like, unless you have a pigul thought about both, there's no pigul, okay? Number 2, which actually doesn't seem like the rabbis or Rabbi Yosi. If you're already confused, you should be confused because neither one seemed to say that. Let's just go back for a minute so we don't get too confused here. Rabbi Yosi said a pigul thought about one just affects that one, not the other. Okay, well, he doesn't seem to think you need a pigul thought about both to have pigul here. As long as you have one, well, it's only that one that's affected, but it is affected. According to the rabbis, a pigul thought about one ruins both. So you definitely don't need to have a kazayit of both in your thoughts to ruin it. And the second thing, which is also going to be important here, is that what it shows here is if someone has a pigul thought about, I'm going to eat a half a zayit of one of the loaves and a half a zayit of the other loaf, they can combine, okay? Because they're viewed as one unit. Now that really disagrees with Rabbi Yosi, because what does Rabbi Yosi say? If you're mefalgal one, you're not mefalgal the other, because they're two distinct units. And not only that, if you take Rav Huna seriously, if in the yerach, right, one calf doesn't affect the other calf when it's all the same meat, right, the same animal, then he really views things as completely discrete, and there would be no way that you could combine these two loaves if even when it's meat, they're not viewed as one unit, okay? So that makes it seem like Rabbi Yosi would view it as two complete different entities. And, right, and what Rav Huna does is he takes Rabbi Yosi even farther, because he says, even in meat where it's one body, we're still going to view them as two complete entities, which means that there's no way, if Rav Huna is right, that this would be Rabbi Yosi's position. Okay, so now we're going to see this all inside. But I wanted to kind of set it up first because it's a little confusing. So the first thing they say from this braita is, it seems very clear, you have to have a pigul thought about both, but not if you had in only one of them. Now, Mani, who does this go according to? And we're now going to see, like I said before, it doesn't match the rabbis, it doesn't match Rabbi Yosi. Even if you have a pigul thought about one of them, both become pigul. So for sure, that's not this. This says you have to have a pigul thought about both. And therefore, it must be ela pshita Rabbi Yosi. Now then, if it's not the rabbis, by default, it has to be Rabbi Yosi. But that in itself is going to be a problem, because now again, what's the problem? The problem with the rabbis is the first point, that until you have a pigul thought about both of them, it's even one of them isn't going to be pigul, and that for sure is, rabbis say, the complete reverse. The problem with Rabbi Yosi is going to be in the tzeruf. The fact that you can combine a half as I thought of this one and that one, when they're two completely separate units, especially the way Rav Huna takes him, right, to the extreme that even in an animal case, there's no way they could combine, and that's what we're going to say right now. So, if you view an animal as one body and one of part of a thought about one affects the other, and then the same with the breads, then that's why we can say that they join. But if you're going to view the animal parts as completely different units, then of course you're going to view these bread parts, which weren't even together in the first place, right? You make the dough completely separately for each one. So of course it's not going to be mitzdaref. So we're now stuck. Okay? So Rav Huna really is quite difficult here. So the first attempt, the attempt to answer this is going to basically be to say, Hamani Rabbihi. Oh, it's not Rabbi Yosi, it's not the rabbis. This braita, which came without a name, is Rabbi's position. Okay, who's Rabbi? We know who Rabbi is, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, but what's his position? Titania, we're going to bring a braita. Hashochet et hakeves le'echol chatzi zayit mechalazo. V'chein chavero le'echol chatzi zayit mechalazo. So now, you have the two sheep, and you slaughter each, okay, so there's two sheep and two loaves. So each sheep, you have a thought about a half an olive bulk, which is not a full requisite amount. While you're slaughtering one, you have a thought about a half an olive bulk of one of them you're going to eat outside the time frame. When you slaughter the second one, you have a thought about a half an olive bulk of the other loaf outside of its time. Comes Rebbe and says, this is kasher, because these things don't combine. Okay, now, okay, what does that have to do with anything? He seems to be saying things don't combine. We're looking for someone who says things do combine. But, Tama da'amal chatzi chatzi. What was his whole problem? Because you said a chatzi zayid of this loaf and a chatzi zayid of that loaf, and each one was while you were doing a different action. Aval amar kezayit mishtehen. What if when you did the first shchita, you said, I'm slaughtering this animal in order to eat a half an olive bulk of this loaf and a half an olive bulk of that loaf. Now, that's not the case he said. So we can assume his issue was specifically because each time you did the act of slaughtering, all you thought about was a half a zayid. But if in the act of slaughtering you thought of a half a zayid of this one and a half a zayid of that one, they would combine, and it would be pigul. Okay? Now, so then we're going to say like this. What do you see here? While you're slaughtering one animal, if you have an act of a half a zayid of this loaf and a half a zayid of that loaf, they combine. That fits with this opinion, that you can be mitzdaref, the other two, to a kazayit. Okay, now they say, wait a minute. But who does he go according to with this whole issue of if you're mafagel one, does it affect the other or not? Where does he hold on that machloket? So now we're going to get stuck a little bit because Iyaliba de Rabbanan, if you hold according to the rabbis, you wouldn't need Ad Shifagel B'Shtehen. You could have said Afilu Be'echad Mehem Nami. Now we're back to where we started because we're assuming, so now he might hold, you could be mitzdaref, half a side of this, half a side of that. But when it comes to, is a thought about one mess up the other, where it says that's why I said the statement says two things. Where does he hold in the machloket in our Mishnah? So if you say he holds like the rabbis and Afilu Be'echamim, you don't need Ad Shifagel B'Shtehen. You could say, right, it doesn't need to be that. It could be just one of them would affect the other as well. And Iyaliba de Rabbi Yosi, now if you say he's holding like Rabbi Yosi, then you get back to where we started with the difficulty, which is Hadar Kusha and Leduchte. Then we're back to saying, wait a minute, but then Rav Huna makes no sense in Rabbi Yosi because how could they combine? Okay, so maybe it's true, a thought about one won't affect the other one unless you have a thought about both. They're both not going to be pigul. That fits with Rabbi Yosi. But the fact that you combine half a side of each doesn't work with him because he views everything as completely separate entities. So now we're back in stuck. To which they answer, the best way to do things when the source doesn't really fit is to change something. Okay, now we're going to change something minor, which becomes something more major, which is what? It's going to sound like a small change, but it's actually a big change. Lo olam aliba de Rabbanan. We're going to explain Rebbe as holding by the rabbis in this place. Okay, well, that really didn't make sense at all. How we're going to fix it? The lo tema ad shifagel bishtehen, ela ema ad shifagel bishnehen. We're going to change from feminine to masculine. It's not ad shifagel bishtehen. We thought it was the loaves. No. He's saying ad shifagel bishnehen because ayit, by the sheep. The sheep is masculine. Keves is masculine. So it's bishnehen va'afilu be'echat mehen. Okay, so now we're going to say like this. Ulafu came into Rabbi Meir. Now, Lo'olam ein b'koret ad shifagel bishnehen, and afilu be'echat mehen, even a thought about one of the loaves. Okay, because he wasn't talking about the bread. Okay, he was talking about ad shifagel bishnehen. Now this fits in with what we saw before about both the rabbis and Rabbi Yosi have this position. You need to be mifagel in both, you need to have the pigul machshava in both the sheep, in the slaughtering of both of the sheep, because each one is only half a matir. Without the other one, you're never going to be able to eat this bread. So you have to have your pigul thought while you're slaughtering both, which is exactly how our Mishnah started. Shachat shnei kvasim with a pigul thought. Ulafu came to Rabbi Meir, and to basically show this Mishnah does not, right, or this braita is also coming to go against Rabbi Meir. Ta'amar mefaglim b'chatzi matil. He says you can, if you're mefagel while you're slaughtering only one of those sheep, that's fine. It doesn't matter. That's pigul. I mean, that's fine. That's pigul. You've ruined it. Okay, even though it was only in part of the action, right? Even though that action itself wouldn't have permitted the bread to be eaten. But if you have your thought while you're slaughtering one of the sheep, let's just go with the basic case. While you're slaughtering one sheep, you have a thought that you're going to eat a kazayit of one of the breads. It's a problem. It's pigul. And, right, and that's why he says, let's just go back for a minute when we reread it, Lo tema ad shifagel b'shtehen, aleima ad shifagel b'shnehen. And now we want to fit this with the rabbis because what he really means is afilu be'echat mehen, and even one of the loaves will ruin the other one as well. Okay? So you can have a pigul thought while you're slaughtering only one animal, according to this, right? I'm sorry. You need only if you have in both animals, right? Now it's going to fit perfectly with what the rabbis say in the Mishnah. And because the shtehen was on the shnehen was specifically on the sheep, right? And then, and even be'echamehen will ruin both. Even if you have a thought only about one loaf, it'll ruin both the loaves, because that's the rabbi's position. Ulafu came to Rabbi Meir, da'amar mefaglim b'chatzi matir. Okay, and then it's to disagree with Rabbi Meir that says you're mefaglim b'chatzi matir kamash malan delo. Okay, so that's what they're assuming now. That really what this braita is coming to tell you is it has to be shnehen, has to be both sheep, and to go against Rabbi Meir. The problem with this is the language of the braita. It said this word la'olam. Now, I said in the beginning, the word la'olam is a very strong word. And the way the Gemara understands la'olam as being a strong word is we disagree on a number of things. Okay? It's not going to be pigul unless you really have this and that. And according to the way we just read it, it's just one thing. It's just saying you need both sheep, right? And as long as you have both sheep, as long as you have a pigul thought about both sheep, even if it's just on one of the loaves, you're going to ruin both of them. That's not a le'olam. That doesn't necessitate a, whoa, we're really disagreeing. So they say, hachi, my le'olam. Iyamar bishlama bishtehen ubishnehem v'Rabbi Yosi ulafukin to Rabbi Meir to Rabbanan kate. Hainu deka'amar le'olam. We're now going to basically say, if you wanted to explain this all according to the rabbis, and that's why, it's the rabbi's position, and then it has nothing to do with Rabbi Yosi, and it doesn't create a problem with Rav Huna, it really doesn't work. Because, in a minute we're going to say why it can't be the rabbis, but I already kind of told you that, but they're basically saying it only makes sense if you say that it's Rabbi Yosi. And it's saying two things. It's saying, number one, now they kind of add, bishtehen and bishnehem. You need both sheep, and your thought in order to ruin both breads needs to be about both breads. Okay, because that's Rabbi Yosi. A thought about one bread doesn't ruin the other. So that's why he's saying bishlama. Let's just go back again. If you say, Iyamar bishlama means if you're going to say it this way, it works. Bishtehen u bishnehen. You need both sheep, a thought about it, and a thought about both loaves to ruin both loaves. Rabbi Yosi. And now why do you say le'olam here? Because he's disagreeing with two different people. La'fukemi to Rabbi Meir. He disagrees with Rabbi Meir on the mefaglim b'chatzi matir issue. No, you're not. And mi de Rabbanan ka'ate. He doesn't think if you have a thought about one loaf, it ruins the other loaf. So that's why it says le'olam. You're never going to have curried unless you both have two sheep and your thought was about both loaves. Okay? Then that works. And then we're back to the problem. Because if that works, right, then it seems like, because it does say in there, b'shtem b'kazayit, the two can be mitzdareh for kazayit. Your thought can be about both, but a half a zayit of each. And then you can combine those things. So then again, we're back to square one about Rav Huna. Anyway, so we'll get there in a minute, but this is back to difficulty against Rav Huna. But if it's just the rabbis come and say you need two sheep, as opposed to Rabbi Meir who says you don't, a thought in one sheep will cause pigul, well, you don't need such a strong word of le'olam. Furthermore, we're now going to have two other difficulties on Rav Huna until we're going to end up just not accepting Rav Huna at all. The statement of Rav Huna, which seemed kind of, not such a big deal statement, that he would say, pigul b'yarech shel yamin is not going to ruin yarech shel small. They're two completely independent units. We're not going to be able to say that. And this is going to be much more simple difficulties, although we're going to have to learn these braita to get there, but you'll see the difficulty is not so complicated like the rest of this was. But we start off with this. Ve'od hamar Rav Ashi. Rav Ashi said the following. Tashma, he brought in this source. Rebbe Omer Mishum Rabbi Yosi. Note it's Rabbi Yosi, so that's going to be the issue here. Okay, now, pigul b'davar hanasa b'chutz pigul, b'davar hanasa b'fnim lo pigul. There's two areas where we do actions that are sacrificial actions for the most part. One is in the courtyard, and one is in the heichal, in the sanctuary. Remember, there's a big courtyard. Within the courtyard, there's a sanctuary. It's a covered space. The courtyard is an open space. The slaughtering is all done in the courtyard. Okay, then there's certain sprinklings for certain animals. Okay, we've talked about them many times. The Parim Minisrafim, the Siri Minisrafim, the ones on Yom Kippur, the Parlim Davashal Tzibur, all those, where the blood gets sprinkled inside. Now, in order for it to be pigul, this braita says, in the name of Rabbi Yosi, that for something to be pigul, it has to be that the action you were doing, now remember, you're always doing one action, having a thought about a future action, and you're going to say, that future action I'm going to do outside the time frame that's allowed. So what he says is, Rabbi Yosi, okay, this source, says that, or Rebbe says in the name of Rabbi Yosi, that your thought, if you're doing an action, and you're having a pigul thought during that action, and you happen to be either in the sanctuary or in the courtyard, you have to be having a thought about doing an action in that same space where you are presently. Okay? We're going to see a lot of examples, so it'll be very clear. That's what it means. Pigul b'davar na'asa b'chutz pigul. If you're standing outside and you have a pigul thought about something that you're going to do outside, again, outside doesn't mean outside the courtyard. Outside means outside the sanctuary, meaning in the courtyard. It's all relative, right? That's chutz compared to pnim. And b'davar na'asa b'fnim lo pigul. But if you're thinking about something that's going to happen inside, it's not pigul. And you're going to see the reverse is true as well. So we're going to start to see cases, and there's one line here in particular that's going to be our proof. Right now we have no idea what this has to do with. Ketzad. So what would be an example? Hayal me b'chutz. You're standing outside. So you're standing outside slaughtering. Okay, you're in the courtyard slaughtering. That's where you slaughter. And you say, I'm going to slaughter in order to sprinkle the blood of this sacrifice, because it's an inner sacrifice, one of the ones that goes inside. I'm going to sprinkle it, let's say, toward the parochet tomorrow, which is not allowed. Lo pigul, that's not pigul. Because that's a thought outside about something, an action you're going to do inside, not pigul. What if you're standing inside the sanctuary? Ve'amar hareini mazen, you're about to sprinkle the blood, and you say, I'm sprinkling this blood, or while you're sprinkling the blood, I'm sprinkling this blood in order, amanat, lahaktir imurim lamachar. I'm going to burn the parts on the altar outside on the outer altar tomorrow, right? Those are the fatty parts that get burnt on the altar. Or, this is the key line for us, lishboch shirayim, or I'm going to pour the shirayim outside. Okay, tomorrow. I'm going to pour the shirayim, remember the remainder of the blood. One of the things by sprinkling the blood, it permits the remainder, right? Without sprinkling the major blood, you don't have a remainder. It's a matir for the sprinkling for the pouring of the remainder of the blood, which gets poured on the altar outside. Lo pigul, there's no pigul. Because that's a thought inside about something done outside. Okay, we still don't really know how the shirayim are connected, but that's going to be the line we're looking for. One more case. Hayaume b'chutz. This is actually really the more important one for us, but it's also about the shirayim. If I'm standing outside and I say I'm slaughtering in order to pour the blood, the remainder of the blood tomorrow, or lahaktir muim lemachar, pigul. That is classic pigul. Okay, now we have a pigul machshava. Now the key is, your pigul thought is about pouring the remainder of the blood. Now what is pigul again? What's the karet in pigul? It's eating what? Eating the meat of that sacrifice. Okay, so now you're going to see the problem. Lishboch shirayim li pagule mai. What becomes pigul here? It's the meat that becomes pigul. Your thought was about the remainder of the blood, but in the end, if you eat the blood, you don't get karet. Okay, how do we know that? Because it's a Mishna in Zvachim. We're going to quote it right now. Ilema li pagule dam. That the blood is pigul, and if you eat the pigul, you're going to get karet. If you eat the blood, you're going to get karet. That can't be. Because the Mishnah says, dam yimepagel. Dam never becomes pigul. Again, a thought about the blood, right? My thought is I'm going to pour the shirayim tomorrow. That makes it pigul. But what becomes pigul? The meat we're going to see. And then you're going to see the problem, okay? But hold off. First, we have to prove that dam, it's not the blood that's pigul, that if I ate that blood, I won't get karet. Because v'hatznan, elu dvarim she'ein chayvim alehem mishum pigul. You're not chayav, basically, I'll tell you the rule, you're not chayav for anything that is not supposed to be eaten. You're not supposed to eat the blood. You're not supposed to eat all the parts that are supposed to be burned on the altar. So, hakometz, the kometz, for example, which is burned on the altar, if you eat it, you don't get karet. Even if it was, you mefagel the mincha, it's only the remainder that becomes pigul. Okay? Halavona, the lavona gets completely burnt. It's also not pigul. The ktoret, the incense. The mincha kohanim, mincha nesachim, mincha kohen mashiach, where the whole mincha gets burned. The hadam, and the blood. So it's not the blood that becomes pigul. So now, what do you see here? Elapshita li fagule basar. What does it mean? If I have a thought while I'm slaughtering that I'm going to pour the remainder of the blood on the base of the altar tomorrow, I mess up the meat of the korban, obviously. Now, hashta umahatam de lo chashebe bebasar gufe amar Rabbi Yosi mefagel. Now, what did he say? Rabbi Yosi said, my thought is about the blood. That's going to mess up the meat. The meat's going to become pigul. So, hacha de chashebe bezevach gufe lo koshke de pigel b'yarech yamin, pigel b'yarech smol. So, if your thought was about blood and you now ruin all the meat of the sacrifice, then what Rav Huna said is completely preposterous. Because Rav Huna said, if my thought is about the right calf, it's not going to mess up the left calf. But if the thought's about the blood, it's going to mess up the whole animal? That makes no sense. If I think about the meat, of course I'm going to mess up all the meat of the animal, even though all I was thinking about was eating one calf. So that completely knocks out Rav Huna, and so does the next source, which is really the same kind of difficulty. Ve'od ha'amar Ravina. Tashma. HaKometz et ha-mincha. Okay, now he says, let's learn from the Mishnah from yesterday's daf. If you're kometz the mincha, le'echol shiareha, okay, to eat the remainder, or what's your thought? Get this one. O lahaktir kumtza lemachar, or you're going to burn the kometz tomorrow. Now, what happens in that case? It's pigul, right? Modeh Rabbi Yosi bezo shepigul. V'chayavim alav karet. Rabbi Yosi says that's pigul. You're chayav karet. Now, laktir kumtza, when you have a thought about burning the kometz, What is going to become pigul about it? If you're going to say the comets is what becomes pigul, because that's what my thought was about, because that's, again, the way Rav Huna takes them so seriously is only the item that you had the pigul thought about can't be, because comets mean mefaga. We just read the Mishna, and one of them is the comets. So that can't be. It must be to mess up the shirayim. Okay, the shirayim become pigul, and what do you see here? Your thought was about the comets, it messed up the shirayim. Again, same theory. There you weren't even thinking about the shirayim. Turn out I'm a bet, and yet mifalge, and yet they become pigul when you were thinking about the comets. Here, when you're talking about the animal itself, the right calf, lo koshake, that it's going to mess up the left calf. So basically, they reject Rav Huna, and Rav Huna can't possibly be right. But what we still haven't figured out is how to understand that braita, because that braita really didn't make so much sense. Because again, the braita seemed to not really go with the rabbis and not really go with Rabbi Yosi. So now we have to figure out, again, let's just go back to the braita. The braita said, Lo'olam ein bo karet ad shifagel b'shtehen b'kazayit. Right? There's not going to be karet unless there's pigul in both of them b'kazayit. Now, we mentioned that, however we're going to explain this, is if you're going to try to explain according to Rabbi Yosi, it ruins what Rav Huna said. But even Rabbi Yosi itself is difficult, because if Rabbi Yosi says you can combine the two loaves to get to a kazayit, that's what it says, ad shifagel b'shtehen b'kazayit, if Rabbi Yosi is the author of that braita, then, and we already said it can't be the rabbis, even though we tried to kind of make it the rabbis, but that was difficult. We ended with a question there. If it's Rabbi Yosi in the Mishna doesn't view the two loaves as a unit. So if they're not viewed as a unit, how can we combine them? So we're kind of stuck. Either they're a unit, and then you can combine them, but then if you had a pigul thought about one, it would ruin the other. And he says, no, a pigul thought about one doesn't ruin the other. So now Rabbi Yochanan is going to come up with an explanation for that braita and how that braita works. Ela amar Rabbi Yochanan, haynu tama de Rabbi Yosi, hakatuv asa'an guf echad, v'hakatuv asa'an shnei gufim. The reason for Rabbi Yosi is like this. The Torah treats these two loaves on the one hand like one unit, and on the other hand like two units. Okay? And then we're going to make one more jump from there, and we're going to explain how that resolves the braita with Rabbi Yosi. Okay? With Rabbi Yosi in the Mishnah. But let's first understand what this means. Hakatuv asa'an guf echad, hakatuv asa'an shnei gufim. We're going to go with Rashi's explanation. Rashi says here, Hakatuv asa'an, I'm in Rashi, Dibor Matchila, Hakatuv asa'an guf echad. I'm just reading now from the Rashi part. Hakatuv asa'an guf echad, dima'ak ve'ahadade, de'ein zog shera b'lizo. You can't have one without the other. Okay, dichtiv, shtayim shnei esronim, dimashma shtayim v'lo echad, uchtiv, okay, here, I'm going to go back to that in a minute, but here's what we really want. Uktiv solet tihiyena. They need to be solet. Now, it says tihiyena, and the language of havaya, like it has to be, kol havaya ikuva. Okay, so there it says they have to be one, meaning, you need havaya, meaning each one has to be there. So they're each essential. If you're missing one bread, you can't have the other. Okay, they each have to be there. You don't have both breads. There's nothing here. That means they're kind of like one. But oto katuv atzmo asa'an shnei gufim, because it says shtayim. It said shtayim shnei esronim. There's two of them. And what they learn for there is that you actually have to make them separately. You make each loaf with just separate dough. You don't put all the dough together and then divide it in two. You take the amount you need, the flour, the fine flour, and each one is done separately. So the Torah in one sentence basically talked about how on the one hand they're together, meaning one can ruin the other. If you don't have one, you can't have the other. But they're also made separately. Okay, so what does that have to do with us? Well, because of that, depending on how you relate to them, they can be separate or together. And that's going to explain the braita and the Mishnah. So, shnei gufim, okay, so now we're going to just read this all inside. So, guf echad dema'ak ve'adade. So they're like one, the fact that one can't be without the other. Shnei gufim da'amar rachmana halachu de'avidi v'halachu de'avidi. That's what I explained to Rashi, but now we're going to read inside. Each one is prepared separately. Okay, they're kneaded separately. The dough, all of that's made separately. So therefore, here goes our therefore. Arvinu mitarvin takatuv asa'an guf echad. If you bring them together, meaning, what do you mean bring them together? That's Rabbi Yosi in the braita. The braita that said, which again didn't say it was Rabbi Yosi, but we're going to assume it's Rabbi Yosi because it doesn't make sense. It's the rabbis. Lo'olam ein bo karet ad shifagel b'shtehen b'kazayit. If you had a thought of a chatzit while you're slaughtering both animals, you thought, right, well, you saw the first one, and while you saw the second one, you thought, I'm going to eat a half a zayit of that loaf and a half of the zayit of that loaf tomorrow. Well, you combine them in your thoughts. So if you combine them, then we view them as one unit, because the Torah also viewed them as one unit. But palginu, it's a bit of a play on words in my mind between pigul, paglinu, which we had before, and palginu. But palginu, if you separate them, meaning, that's our Mishnah. What did you say? While you were slaughtering both animals, you had a thought you're going to eat loaf 1 in the wrong time, right? You didn't think about loaf 2. You separated your thoughts. So if in your thoughts you separated them, mipalge, they're viewed separately. And that's why Rabbi Yosi says, if you're mafagel one, you're not mafagel the other. And that resolves the braita with Rabbi Yosi. Because again, remember why we said the braita, and then that's, I'm just going to read the words, zakatuva sa'an shnei gufim. So because the Torah in certain areas made them 1, in certain areas made them 2, that allows Rabbi Yosi the flexibility to say, oh, it really depends how you view them. If your thoughts were about both of them, then they combine. If your thoughts were about one of them, then they're separate, because you weren't thinking about putting them together. Because remember, the source about Ambo Karet, Achifagabush, there can't be Karet until you do both, right? The rabbis don't say that. The rabbis say a thought about one ruins the other. So we couldn't really explain it to the rabbis, even though we kind of tried some unique, by changing it to Shnehen, we also had a problem with that because the language La'olam didn't really work either. So in the end, we explain this all according to Rabbi Yosi, and it seems pretty clear, although it never really says it, that the Gemara rejects what Rav Huna said. The Rabbi Yosi wouldn't say pigul b'yarech shel yamin is not mefagel yarech shel smol. Okay, so now we're moving on to a little bit more simpler stuff, although it's going to get a little more confusing further down. But by Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan now asks a question. Pigul b'lachmei todah mahu. What about the lachmei todah? Well, we have 40 loaves. Okay, there's 4 different types and 10 of each type. What if, again, is it going to be the same thing here? What if you have a pigul thought about one? Is it going to affect the other, right? Where Rabbi Yosi and the rabbis disagree in the same case. B'mincha ma'afeh mahu. It's another case. If I voluntarily offer to bring what's called a mincha ma'afeh, it's one that also you bake 10 loaves with it, either rikikim or they're called lechem matzot, I think. Matzot, what's it called? Something. Lechem matzot, it's these flat breads. Okay, 2 different types of flat breads. So you have to bring 10 of either that one or that one. Mahu. What would be the halacha? Again, the point being that there's a series of breads, and if you have a pigul thought about one, is it going to affect the other? So Tani, the Rav Tachlifa Mimarav, Rav Tachlifa from Israel brought a braita. It says, V'chena ta'omer b'lachmei todah, v'chena ta'omer b'mincha ma'afeh. Same thing. Anytime you have a group of breads, a number of them, we're going to have the same debate. Is pigul of one affect all of them, or pigul of one only affect that one? Okay, and then again, that means, again, just to keep reviewing, get this idea of pigul, which is a little, not what you might have thought, if someone eats that bread after it became pigul, because while you were slaughtering, again, depending whether you're Rabbi Meir or Rabbi Yosi and the rabbis, while you were slaughtering either both sheep or one sheep, right, or in this case, it would be the lachmei todah would just be one. There's only one matir there. It's the animal that goes with it that permits the breads. If you slaughtered one with a thought about one loaf, would that affect all the loaves? And then if somebody eats any one of the other loaves, are they going to get karet or not? Tanu Rabbanan. Now we get to another braita. B'shat shchita chishev le'echol chatzi zayid, u'b'shat zrika chishev le'echol chatzi zayid. Now we talk about a different thing. Shchita is a matir, a complete matir. Okay, before we were talking about there were 2 kvasim and there was half a matir, right? Each one only partially matir something. But shchita itself, even though you also need to do zrika, but shchita is a complete matir because it completely permits you to pour the blood on the altar. And the zrika in and of itself is a complete matir because it completely permits, right, the meat to be burned on the altar and the parts that get burned. It completely permits the shirayim to be poured. It completely permits whatever part you're going to eat to be eaten. Okay, they're each a complete matir. But what if? But also they sort of go together, right? You do shchita, then you do zrika. So what if you have a thought while you're slaughtering that you're going to eat a half a zayit tomorrow? Okay. And then you have a thought that while you're sprinkling the blood, that you're going to eat a half a zayit tomorrow. Do those 2 combine to make, right, that we started our shir today with about things combining. So did these combine? So they say yes. Pigul, mipnei shechita u'zrika mitztarfim. You can combine a thought about shchita and a thought of zrika. It's all the same animal, so you can combine those thoughts. Now there were 2 ways to understand, to infer something from here. Because it only talked about 2 of the 4 avodot. There's also holacha, and there's walking the blood, and there's kabbalah, accepting the blood. I should have said in the opposite order, collecting the blood and walking it over. So ikeda amre shchitu zrika detravayu matirin in kabbalah v'holacha lo. Now, some people saw this braita and said, look, it said shchita and zrika. It sounds like only shchita and zrika, not anything else. So that means kabbalah and holacha, even though a pigul thought during those actions would mess up a korban, but they wouldn't combine, and they wouldn't combine with shchita and zrika, they wouldn't combine with each other, because they're not the actual matir. Nothing really gets permitted when you do them. Now, it happens to be, you can have a pigul thought that will ruin your korban, but you don't combine anything here, because it's less strong. Vikad amre, some people say the opposite. The big chiddush is that even shchita and zrika could combine, because what? Hanach demer chakan. They're distant from each other. Shchita is the first thing you do, zrika is the last of the four actions. Even though they're so far distant, still your thought can combine. And obviously, kol shekain, all the more so, hanach demekarban, all the more so, all those ones that are in the middle, that are near each other. So of course you combine shchita and kabbalah, because they're right next to each other. And even shchita and holacha are closer than shchita and zrika. So one thinks this means all four actions. Some people think it means only those two. Okay. But anyway, now they're going to bring a contradiction. Ini, is this really true? Patani Levi brought a braita that said, Arba avodot emet starfot lepigul. Shchitu, zrika, kabbalah, v'holacha. Completely against the braita. Shchita, kabbalah, holacha, and zrika. Okay, forgetting about how we inferred about kabbalah and zrika, but kabbalah and holacha. But shchita and zrika don't combine according to this. Completely against this braita. So Amar Rava lo kasha harebi harabanan. Rava says, don't worry. One is Rebbe's position and one is the rabbis. Ditanya. Okay, what we're going to say is Levi's braita goes like Rebbe. Now here we're going to see what's Rebbe. Now we saw this before, although we really only dealt with the inference from this, but now we're going to deal with the case itself. We had this earlier in the daf. If you slaughter one of the sheep with a thought you're going to eat a half a zayit from this challah, and then you slaughter the other sheep with a thought about half a zayit, that is completely kasher. Okay, now before, you might remember, there were cases where people said it's pasul, but there's no karid, right? It's not really pigul, but you can't do it anyway. That's like, we're going to be extra careful and just say, okay, rabbinic law, we're going to forbid this. He says it's completely kasher. You've done nothing wrong. Amalei. Okay, so now, what does he say? Because you can't combine shchita of one sheep with shchita of the other sheep. So now the jump is, well, if you can't combine shchita of one sheep with shchita of the other sheep, then you also can't combine shchita and zrika. Okay, that's the assumption. And then Levi's braita, which says the thoughts of shchita and zrika don't combine, is basically Rebbe. Now, Abai is going to say, no, those are not the same. Amalei Abai, imar deshamalei l'Rebbe, chatzi matir v'chatzi achila. Right? What was Rebbe's problem? Because it's a chatzi matir. Shchita of one sheep and the two sheep is only half a matir. But shchita and zrika, right, each one is a complete matir. You can't compare those. Because shchita is an action that's a complete action that permits the blood to be sprinkled. And zrika is a complete action that permits the meat to be burned on the altar or the meat to be eaten. Right? So, that's different. So when Rebbe said it was chatzi matir and chatzi achili. You have half of this and half of that. Of course, that's not going to combine, or you could say it's not going to combine. But he won't necessarily do the same thing if you have kulo matir v'chatzi achila mishamalei. But if you have a complete matir like shchita and half a shear of eating, and then you have another complete matir of zrika with half a shear of eating, maybe Rebbe would think that you could combine those. So he doesn't like Rava's answer. Now, Amalei, now we're going to have someone who tries to contradict Abaye and say, Abaye, still something doesn't jive with what you're saying. But we're going to actually answer it, and we're going to really be left with this question on Rava, and then really without a good answer to the question. So Amalei Rava bar Rav Hanan, there's a different Rava, la Abaye. Now, if Rebbe really holds like what you're saying, that we're going to distinguish between half a matir, half a shear of eating, to a whole matir with half a shear of eating, we're going to say those two can combine, okay, but those can't, right, combine to make it pigul, and the other ones can't. Well, ligs or chatzi matir, v'chatzi achila, atu kula matir v'chatzi achila. You should make a gzeira at least on it. It should be one of those cases of pasul v'ein bo karet. It's disqualified, because if you allow and say it's not pigul when you have a chatzi matir and chatzi achila, with a chatzi matir, chatzi achila, and the two sheep with the two half eatings don't combine, you might think, and it's kasher, remember, Rebbe said, it's kasher, it's mamash totally fine, there's nothing wrong with it at all, there's no rabbinic prohibition, But if he thinks that shchita and zrika combine, if you have a half achila there and a half achila there, well, then you should forbid that because of that. Now, if you think, well, who does that? Well, Dahar Rabbi Yosi Gazar Rabbanan Gazar. And now we're going to bring cases. There's a chart on the sheet if you want to look at it, where each of them were gozer. Rabbi Yosi Gazar Ditnan, and that's all these cases where I said it says pasul ve'ein bo karet. That means they made a gzera. They said, well, we're going to forbid this because of a different case. Laktir levona talamachar. Rabbi Yosi omer pasul ve'ein bo karet. If you remember, this was yesterday's daf where we said ein matir mefagalet hamatir. So if you're doing the burning of the komets, and your thought is, I'm going to burn the levona tomorrow, ein matir right? Ein matir mefagalet hamatir. So it's not a problem. However, he still says pasul ve'ein bo karet. He still says, but midrabanan, don't do it. Okay? So, chachamim omrim pigul v'chayvim alav karet. Okay, that's just the rabbis disagreeing, and they think it's actually completely forbidden. Rabbanan nami gazrei. Now, here's what the rabbis will go. Zer ditnan. This is in Daf Tet Zayin, and we actually quoted this before. Pigel b'kometz. We quoted Rabbi Meir part of it. Pigel b'kometz v'lo b'levona. This is the mafaglim b'chatzi matir. So, pigel b'kometz v'lo b'levona v'lo b'kometz. Remember, in order to permit the shirayim of the mincha, you have to burn the levona and the kmitza. So what if you only burned one and not the other? So Rabbi Meir omer pigul v'chayavim alav karei, because he says mefaglim b'chatzi matir. We don't care that it was half a matir. V'chachamim orim ein bo karei ad shechabel b'hagel b'chol matir. He says it's not karei until you do the whole thing. Now what does he say? It's not karei, but it doesn't say it's permitted. It doesn't say kasher. So here again, it's mefaglim b'chatzi matir. He doesn't think so, but he says it's going to be disqualified anyway. So here you see all these other rabbis. So if you're going to say that Rebbe, the whole thing was Abaye, so Rebbe distinguishes between this case and that case. This case is completely permitted, and that case is completely pigul. Doesn't make sense. That case is complete. If the second case is completely pigul, then the other case we should at least make it pasul. So now they're going to differentiate and say no. The rabbis and Rabbi Yosi each had a very particular reason in each of those cases to be gozer, because there was a very similar case where that wouldn't be relevant, and they didn't want you to confuse the cases. Okay, so and that doesn't exist by Rebbe's case. So we're going to see it right now. Amar lehachi hashta bishlama hatam gazer Rabbi Yosi kometz de levona atu kometz de mincha. If while you're taking the kmitza, you have a thought to burn the levona outside its time, that's not pigul, but it would be because ein matir mefagalat hamatir. One is the kometz, one is the levona. But if you were to have a thought while you're doing the kmitza, you're taking the kmitza out, that you're going to burn the kometz, the kmitza itself, outside its time, that's the same matir. That would be pigul. So we don't want to permit completely a case where your thought was about burning the levona, when your thought about burning the kmitza would be completely disqualified by, and karet. So that's why there's a case where you might confuse it, so because of that. Rabbanan gazrei kometz atu kometz menachot, ulevona atu levona haba bezichin. Keves nami, keves atu, keves chavero. Now, we're going to basically go through all these cases and say that in all these cases, what was the issue with the rabbis? What was the case? Well, you have to burn the kmitza and the levona. But there is a case in the menachot where you don't have to burn both, because there's only kmitza, there's no levona. So because of the menachot case, you forbid it. Levona, sometimes you do the levona all by itself. Yes, it's true in the mincha, you have to burn the levona and the kmitza, and it's only chatzi matir. But in the bezichei levona for the lechem apanim, just the bezichin are burnt. Or if you voluntarily offer a levona, then just the levona is burnt. So you could confuse it with that kind of case. Or kvasim nami, sometimes, right? Keves atu keves chavero. Well, if I say one keves, since it's only chatzi matir, there's no pigul. But then, what if you did it in the next one? You might think, oh, well, it's not pigul, because if I did in the first one, it's not pigul. If I did in the second one also, maybe it's not pigul. But of course it is, because it's both together. Or bezach hatu bezach chavero. If you have the two bezichei levona, one is no good without the other, right? You don't permit the breads until... But if you did one and you say that's not pigul, then you might have allowed the other and thought, oh, that... So once you do one, we say it's pasul. It's already disqualified, so that you don't get confused with another case. But in our case, but there is no case of a chatzi matir or chatzi achila that happens in a normal case. Like there is no normal case where that would happen, that we would have to be gozer. That's why Rebbe is not gozer. So in the end, Abaye distinguished between Rebbe in the case that we talked about and Rebbe here. You can't say Rebbe's Levi, and that's why we're kind of stuck. And now they're just going to further support this reading that we explained Abaye about, because hachinami mistabra, that the reason why the rabbis say it's karet, it's pasul, ve'ein bo karet, but they do disqualify, is because of the concern of the Menachot, and then with all them the other things, because look at the Mishnah there. Mishum hachi, the katane seifa, it says there, Modim chachamim leRabbi Meir b'minchachot menchat knaot, shim pigel b'kometz, shepigul v'chayavim alav karet, shakometz hu amatir. There's a very strange line in that Mishnah. It's strange because it's completely obvious and there's no reason to say it. The whole Mishnah is about what if there's two matirim and you only have a thought of one and not the other. So then it comes and tells you, well, even though if you have a thought about the levona, since there's a kmitza also, and you haven't, right, or you have a thought about the kmitza and not the levona, it's not going to be pigul according to the rabbis, but it is karet, right? I mean, it is pasul. But he also just adds that in the Menachot, Menchat Knaot, if your thought was, you had a thought during, about the kometz, it's going to completely destroy it because there is no levona. Now, the Gemara says, why does he have to bring this? Pshita, it's obvious. We all know there's no levona in the Menachot. And therefore, obviously, it's the only matir. And obviously, then it would be pigul. So, mi kamatir achwina, there is no other matir. And so, why did he mention Menchat Knaot and Menchat Chote here? They wanted to bring up Menachot in there so you'd understand the reason why he says pasul, it's disqualified, even though it's not really pigul, is because of the case of Menachot. He wanted to just mention it in the Mishnah so you know that that's why he forbade the others. But again, we're left with this question about these two braita that seem to contradict, and we tried to say one is Rebbe, but Abaye kind of rejected that. We're going to stop here for today and start up with the next Mishnah in tomorrow's stuff. So, what did we do here today? We really dealt with this machloket, Rabbi Yosi and the rabbis, and we first started out with this statement of Rav Huna that got us very worked up, or got the rabbis worked up, because how could he apply about the shtei halot to the meat as well? And we eventually rejected it, number one, because of this braita that doesn't really fit according to anyone according to that. And then we had those two sources which seem very clear that if you have a thought about blood or about the kmitza, it messes up the shirayim or the meat, which are completely different. So of course, part of the meat would mess up the other part of the meat, in which case Rabbi Yochanan comes and just resolves the braita with Rabbi Yosi and ignores Rav Huna, and basically Rav Huna seemed to be rejected. And then we got into this question, would the same thing apply for lechem todah and lechem afeh? We said yes, that same machloket in the Mishnah about does one mess up the other? And then from there we got to this shchita and zrika combining, because we had started this whole thing about combining, because we quoted that braita, would shchita and zrika combine, a chatzi zayit this, chatzi zayit that? We said yes, question about halacha and Kabbalah, and then we got to this difficulty with this braita of Levi, which I guess just really in the end is just a different approach. But first they tried to say this should really match up, and Rava tried to say, well, maybe it's Rebbe and the rabbis, but it can't be Rebbe, which we basically went on to prove right now. And with that, we finished for today. Wishing everyone a good day and a Shavuot tov.